I went on vacation to visit the Caribbean. When I came back, my daughter had liquidated my house for $100,000 below its value to invest in my son-in-law's business. When I opened the door, they mocked me. "What are you doing here? You're homeless now." I replied that the house they sold was actually, "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." The Caribbean sun had been kind to me. For 2 weeks, I'd felt like myself again. Not Donald the worrier, not Donald the provider, just Donald. At 62, I figured I deserved those lazy mornings on the beach in Barbados, the rum punches at sunset, the simple pleasure of reading a book without my phone buzzing every 5 minutes. The flight back to Denver was smooth, and I dozed most of the way, still feeling that vacation glow. I'd even managed to bring back some local rum for Skylar and that expensive coffee Marvin always went on about. Maybe it was silly, but I still believed in small gestures. After all, Skylar was my only daughter, my only family, really, and despite our occasional disagreements, I loved her fiercely. The taxi pulled up to my house on Maple Street just as the sun was setting. I'd lived there for 18 years, ever since the divorce from Skylar's mother. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. A modest 2-story colonial with blue shutters and a small front garden that I took pride in maintaining. The roses were blooming beautifully. Mrs. Patterson next door must have watered them while I was gone, bless her. But something felt off as I approached the front door. There were unfamiliar cars in the driveway, a sleek black sedan and a moving truck. My stomach clenched. Maybe Skylar was helping a friend move? Though she'd never mentioned anything about that before I left. I fumbled with my keys, noticing that the lock felt different somehow. When I finally got the door open, the sight that greeted me stopped me cold. The living room was completely empty, not just rearranged, empty. The couch where I'd watched Sunday football for years, the coffee table that still had ring stains from where Skylar used to set her hot chocolate as a teenager, my father's old recliner. Everything was gone. What the hell? I dropped my suitcase right there in the doorway. That's when I heard voices coming from the kitchen. Familiar voices that made my blood run cold. "I told you he'd show up eventually." Marvin's voice carried that smug tone I'd learned to hate over the past 2 years since he'd married my daughter. "Well, he's going to have to deal with it," Skylar replied, and I could hear that defensive edge she got when she knew she was in the wrong. I walked toward the kitchen, my legs feeling like lead. Each step echoed in the empty house, amplifying the growing dread in my chest. When I reached the kitchen doorway, I saw them both sitting at my kitchen table, the only piece of furniture left in the house. Skylar looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not guilt, not embarrassment, something colder. "Dad, you're back early." "Early?" My voice came out as a croak. "What's going on here? Where's all my furniture?" Marvin leaned back in his chair, that irritating smirk spreading across his face. He was a tall, thin man who always dressed like he was heading to a business meeting, even when he was just sitting in someone's kitchen. "Donald, sit down. We need to talk." "Don't tell me to sit down in my own house. Where are my things?" Skylar stood up slowly. At 34, she still had that defiant posture she'd perfected as a teenager. Chin raised, arms crossed. "Dad, the house sold. We closed on it 3 days ago." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Sold? What do you mean sold? This is my house." "Actually," Marvin interjected, pulling out a manila folder from the table, "it's not. It never was." My hands started shaking. "That's impossible. I've been paying the mortgage for 18 years. I've been living here for 18 years. Skylar's expression softened just slightly, but not with sympathy. More like the look you'd give a confused child. "Dad, the house has been in my name since I turned 18. Don't you remember? You put it in my name for tax reasons after the divorce." The room started spinning. I gripped the door frame to steady myself. That's not how it was supposed to work. You were supposed to transfer it back to me when you were older." "Transfer it back?" Marvin laughed, actually laughed. Why would she do that? "She's been the legal owner for 16 years. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, searching for some sign of the little girl who used to make me Father's Day cards with her tiny handprints. "Skylar, honey, you can't just sell my house without telling me. Where am I supposed to live?" "That's not really our problem anymore, is it?" Marvin stood up, straightening his tie. "The sale went through. The new owners take possession tomorrow morning." "Our problem?" I stared at him. "This is my daughter we're talking about. Skylar, Tell me you didn't really do this. But Skylar was looking at the floor now, and I could see the truth in her avoidance. We needed the money, Dad. Marvin's business opportunity came up, and we had to act fast. What business opportunity requires you to sell your father's house without even telling him? A restaurant chain, Marvin said proudly. 3 locations to start with. We needed liquid capital fast. So you sold my house for restaurant money? My voice was getting louder now, echoing in the empty space. It wasn't your house, Skylar snapped, finally looking at me again. Legally, it was mine, and yes, we sold it. For $250,000. I felt my knees go weak. $250? This house is worth at least $350, maybe $375 in this market. Marvin shrugged. We needed a quick sale. Cash buyer, no inspections, closed in a week. You sold my house for $100,000 under market value. The betrayal was crushing, but the financial stupidity made it even worse. We sold my house, Skylar corrected, her voice turning cold again. And we got what we needed. I stared at my daughter. This woman I'd raised, supported through college, walked down the aisle just 2 years ago. Skylar, where are my things? My clothes, my photos, my father's watch collection? Most of it's in storage, she said, not meeting my eyes. Unit 47 at you store it on Colfax. Here's the key. She tossed a small silver key onto the table. Most of it? Marvin cleared his throat. Well, some things weren't worth storing. We had to make decisions. What kinds of decisions? Your father's old furniture, some of the outdated electronics, books that were just taking up space. Skylar listed off items like she was reading a grocery list. You threw away my father's furniture, his desk where he wrote letters to my mother during the war. Dad, it was falling apart. No one wants old furniture like that anymore. I felt something break inside me. Not just my heart, but something deeper. Some fundamental trust that I'd never imagined could be shattered. How long have you been planning this? Skylar and Marvin exchanged a look. A few months, she admitted. You've been planning to sell my house for months, and you didn't think to mention it when I told you about my vacation? We figured it would be easier this way, Marvin said. No drawn-out emotional conversations, no guilt trips. Guilt trips? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I'm your father, Skylar. Doesn't that mean anything to you? She sighed like I was being unreasonable. Of course it does, but I'm a married woman now. I have to think about my future, my family. I thought I was your family. The silence that followed was deafening. In that moment, standing in my empty kitchen, looking at my daughter's indifferent face and her husband's smug expression, I realized that I'd lost more than just my house. I'd lost my daughter too. So, what am I supposed to do now? I asked quietly. Marvin checked his expensive watch. Well, you can't stay here. The new owners are doing a walkthrough tomorrow morning at 8. Where am I supposed to go tonight? Skylar finally showed a flicker of something that might have been guilt. There's a nice Holiday Inn about 10 minutes from here. I'm sure they have rooms available. I stared at her for a long moment, waiting for her to realize what she'd just suggested, that her father, who had just returned from vacation to find himself homeless, should go sleep in a hotel room. She didn't seem to realize anything. I see, I said finally. And in that moment, standing in my empty house, looking at the 2 people who had betrayed me so completely, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done being Donald the pushover, done being Donald the easy target. It was time they learned exactly who they'd been dealing with all these years. I spent that first night at the Holiday Inn staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what had happened. The room smelled like industrial cleaning solution and stale cigarettes, and every time I closed my eyes I could see Skylar's face when she told me to find a hotel. The indifference in her expression haunted me more than anything else. By morning, I'd made a decision. I needed to understand exactly how this had happened. How had I managed to lose my house without even knowing it was possible? I drove to the law offices of Hartwell and Associates downtown. Bill Hartwell had handled my divorce 18 years ago, and if anyone would have records of what happened with the house, it would be him. The building was one of those old Denver brick structures that had been renovated into something modern but still maintained its character. Bill looked older than I remembered. His hair completely gray now, but his handshake was still firm. Donald, good to see you. Though I have to say, you look terrible. I feel terrible. I sat down in the leather chair across from his desk. Bill, I need you to help me understand something. My house on Maple Street. Skylar says it's been in her name since she turned 18. Is that possible? Bill's expression shifted, becoming more serious. Let me pull your file. He walked to a filing cabinet and returned with a thick folder. As he flipped through the pages, I could see his frown deepening. "Here it is," he said finally. "Yes, we did transfer the deed to Skylar's name in 2006. She had just turned 18. But why? I don't remember agreeing to that." Bill put on his reading glasses and studied the documents more carefully. "According to my notes here, you were concerned about protecting assets from your ex-wife. Diana was making noises about coming back for more in the divorce settlement, claiming she deserved half the house's equity since you'd bought it during the marriage." The memory came flooding back. Diana had been calling me constantly that summer, demanding more money, threatening to take me back to court. I'd been terrified of losing everything I'd worked for. "You suggested putting the house in Skylar's name as a protective measure," Bill continued. "The idea was that Diana couldn't claim an asset that belonged to your daughter, and since Skylar was 18, it was legal. But I was supposed to get it back, right? When the divorce was final and Diana couldn't make any more claims." Bill flipped through more pages, his frown deepening. "That's where things get complicated, Donald. According to these documents, the transfer was permanent. There's no mention of any arrangement to transfer it back to you." My blood ran cold. That can't be right. I would never have agreed to just give away my house. "I'm afraid the documents are very clear. Skylar became the sole legal owner of the property. You've been living there as well, essentially as her guest for the past 16 years. I felt sick. "But I've been paying the mortgage. I've been paying all the bills, the taxes, the maintenance. That doesn't change the legal ownership. I'm sorry, Donald, but your daughter has every right to sell that house. She always has." I left Bill's office in a daze. How could I have been so stupid? How could I have signed away my house and not even realized it? But as I sat in my car in the parking garage, another memory surfaced. A conversation I'd had with Skylar just a few months after the transfer. She'd been starting college, and I'd mentioned something about putting the house back in my name now that the divorce was final. "Why would we do that, Dad?" she'd said. "This way, if anything happens to you, I don't have to worry about probate or anything. It's already mine." At the time, it had seemed practical. I was 44, healthy, not planning on dying anytime soon, and Skylar was my daughter. Of course I trusted her. I'd been an idiot. I drove to the storage unit on Colfax Avenue, dreading what I might find. The facility was one of those sprawling complexes of orange metal buildings, the kind that sprouted up everywhere as people accumulated more stuff than they could fit in their homes. Unit 47 was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet. When I rolled up the metal door, my heart sank. My entire life had been crammed into this tiny space like someone was playing Tetris with my belongings. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, furniture was piled on top of furniture, and I could see that several items were already damaged. My father's antique desk, the one where he'd written love letters to my mother during World War II, was shoved against the back wall with boxes of books stacked on top of it. The finish was scratched, and one of the legs looked loose. I started going through boxes, taking inventory of what was there and what was missing. My photo albums were there, thank God, but many of the frames were broken. My mother's china was packed carelessly, and I could hear pieces rattling when I lifted the box. Then I found something that made me stop cold. In a box marked Dad's desk stuff, I found an old manila envelope with my father's handwriting on it. Important papers. Donald's inheritance. Inside were documents I'd forgotten about, papers my father had given me shortly before he died. I sat down on an overturned box and read through them. Property deeds, investment statements, bank account information. Most of it was for assets that had been liquidated years ago to pay for his medical care and funeral expenses. But there was one document that made my hands shake, a deed to a property in Montana, 40 acres outside of Missoula, with a small cabin and some outbuildings. According to the paperwork, my father had bought it in 1973 as a hunting retreat. The deed was in my name, transferred to me when I turned 21. I'd completely forgotten about it. After my father died and I was dealing with the grief and the medical bills, this remote property had just slipped my mind. I'd never even visited it. But according to these documents, I'd owned it for over 40 years. I pulled out my phone and called a real estate agent in Missoula. "Hi, I'm calling about some property I own outside your city. I'm wondering what it might be worth in today's market." After giving her the legal description from the deed, she put me on hold. When she came back, her voice had changed, become more interested. "Mr. Davidson, are you thinking about selling this property?" "Maybe. Why?" "Well, the area you're describing has become very desirable in recent years. A lot of development has moved in that direction. Properties like yours, especially with water rights, are going for anywhere from $800,000 to $1.2 million, depending on the exact location and condition." I nearly dropped the phone. "Did you say 1.2 million? That's for premium properties with good access and water rights. But even conservative estimates would put your 40 acres at 700,000 to 800,000. I thanked her and hung up, my mind reeling. While Skylar had been selling my house for $100,000 under market value, I'd been sitting on a property worth almost $1 million, a property she knew nothing about. I spent the rest of the afternoon at the storage unit, going through every box, every document. In another envelope, I found investment statements for accounts I'd forgotten about, CDs that had been automatically renewing for years, even some old savings bonds my parents had bought for me as a child. When I added it all up, I wasn't the broke, homeless old man Skylar and Marvin thought they'd left behind. I was wealthy. For the first time since I'd walked into my empty house, I smiled. Skylar thought she'd been so clever, selling her house out from under me. She thought she'd left me with nothing, forced me to come crawling back to her for help. She had no idea what she'd actually done. She'd set me free. That evening, I sat in my hotel room with a bottle of wine from room service and made a list. Properties to visit, investments to verify, accounts to access. For 18 years, I'd been living like a tenant in my own house, paying bills for a property that wasn't even mine, while sitting on assets worth over $1 million. Tomorrow, I would start the process of claiming what was actually mine. And Skylar and Marvin would discover that they'd played their game with the wrong man. I raised my glass to the empty hotel room. "Here's to new beginnings," I said aloud. Outside my window, Denver sparkled in the darkness, full of possibilities I was just beginning to understand. 3 days after discovering my Montana property, I was sitting in a coffee shop on 16th Street, waiting to meet with Tom Bradley, a private investigator I'd hired to look into Marvin's business ventures. I'd spent 40 years in accounting before retiring, and something about Marvin's story didn't add up. Restaurant chains didn't just appear overnight, and legitimate businesses didn't require someone to sell their house for quick cash. Tom was a former Denver police detective, recommended by Bill Hartwell. He was a compact man in his 50s with graying temples and the kind of observant eyes that made you feel like he was cataloging everything about you. "Donald," he said, sliding into the booth across from me, "I've got some interesting information about your son-in-law." He opened a manila folder and spread several documents across the table. "Marvin James Patterson, age 36, born in Las Vegas, moved to Denver 4 years ago. That's when he met your daughter, right?" "About that time, yes. They met at some charity fundraiser downtown." "Right. Well, here's where it gets interesting." Tom pointed to a background check report. "Marvin's got quite a history in Nevada. 3 arrests for gambling-related offenses, 1 conviction for check fraud, and here's the kicker. He was investigated twice for running illegal gambling operations." My stomach dropped. Investigated? Never convicted on the gambling charges. Charges were dropped both times, probably due to lack of evidence or witnesses who suddenly developed amnesia. Tom flipped to another page. "But here's what's really concerning. This restaurant chain he told you about, it doesn't exist." "What do you mean it doesn't exist?" Tom pulled out his laptop and turned it toward me. I searched business registrations in Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico. No restaurant chain registered to Marvin Patterson or any variation of his name. No business licenses, no permits, no incorporation papers. I stared at the screen, feeling a familiar knot forming in my stomach. So what did he do with the money from the house? That's where it gets really interesting. Tom pulled out bank records. I have a contact who was able to trace some financial activity. The $250,000 from your house sale went into an account Marvin opened just 2 weeks before the closing. 2 weeks, so he was planning this. Gets better. Within 72 hours of the money hitting that account, most of it was withdrawn in cash. Large withdrawals, all just under the $10,000 reporting limit. I felt sick. He's laundering money. That would be my guess, but here's the part that's going to really interest you. Tom leaned forward, lowering his voice. I did some digging into his associates here in Denver. Marvin's been hanging around some very unsavory characters. Bobby Torino, Mickey Castellano. These are guys who run high-stakes poker games in warehouse districts, loan money at 20% interest, that kind of thing. Loan sharks. Exactly. And according to my sources, Marvin owes them a considerable amount of money. We're talking six figures. I leaned back in the booth, trying to process this information. So he sold my house to pay gambling debts. That's what it looks like. And your daughter either knows and doesn't care, or she's been completely fooled by his restaurant story. I thought about Skylar's behavior when I'd confronted them in the kitchen, the way she'd avoided my eyes, the defensive tone in her voice. She knows. Tom nodded grimly. I was afraid of that. There's more, Donald. Marvin's not just in debt to these guys. He's working for them now. What do you mean working for them? My contact says he's been running a sports betting operation out of a bar on the south side, taking bets, collecting money, probably skimming a percentage for himself. It's all illegal, and if he gets caught, he's looking at serious federal charges. I felt my world shifting again, and my daughter is married to him, which makes her potentially complicit. If she knows about his activities and benefits from them financially, she could be charged as an accessory. I sat there in silence, watching the pedestrians walk past the coffee shop window. Normal people living normal lives, not dealing with criminal sons-in-law and daughters who sold their father's houses to fund illegal gambling operations. There's something else, Tom said quietly. I think Marvin might be planning to run. Run where? My source says Bobby Torino's getting impatient about the money Marvin owes him. The $250 from your house was just a down payment. Marvin still owes them at least another $100,000, and word is he doesn't have it. So what does that mean? It means Marvin's in serious danger. These aren't the kind of guys who accept late payments, and if he's smart, he's already making plans to disappear before they decide to collect in other ways. I thought about Skylar, my little girl who used to build blanket forts in the living room and make me tea parties with her stuffed animals. What about my daughter? Tom's expression softened slightly. That depends on how much she knows and how involved she is. If she's just been naive and trusted the wrong guy, she might be able to get out of this relatively clean. But if she's been actively participating in his schemes, she could go to prison. It's possible. I stared at the documents spread across the table, evidence of my son-in-law's criminal activities and my daughter's potential involvement. Part of me wanted to call Skylar right now, warn her, beg her to leave Marvin before it was too late. But then I remembered her face in that empty kitchen, the coldness when she'd told me to find a hotel, the casual cruelty when she'd described throwing away my father's furniture. Donald, Tom said gently, I know this is your daughter we're talking about. If you want to try to help her, to warn her somehow. I shook my head. She made her choice when she decided to sell my house to fund a criminal operation. She chose Marvin over me. Are you sure about that? I thought about it for a long moment. Tom, when someone shows you who they really are, you should believe them. My daughter showed me exactly who she is when she looked me in the eye and told me to go find a hotel room. Tom gathered up the documents. So what do you want to do with this information? I want you to keep monitoring the situation. If Marvin runs, I want to know. If Skylar gets arrested, I want to know. But I'm not going to warn them or help them. You're sure? I'm sure. I stood up and pulled out my wallet. What do I owe you for this? $500 should cover it. I handed him the cash. Keep watching them, Tom. Something tells me this story isn't over yet. That evening, I sat in my hotel room with a glass of whiskey, thinking about everything Tom had told me. My daughter wasn't just complicit in selling my house. She was potentially complicit in criminal activity. The sweet little girl who used to curl up in my lap to watch cartoons had become someone I didn't recognize. But maybe that wasn't entirely true. Maybe the signs had been there all along, and I'd just chosen not to see them. I remembered when Skylar was in college how she'd called me crying about being broke, needing money for books or rent or some emergency. I'd always sent whatever she asked for, no questions asked. But then I'd started noticing that her social media was full of pictures from expensive restaurants and shopping trips. When I'd mentioned it once, she'd gotten angry, accused me of not trusting her. I should have trusted my instincts then. I thought about her engagement to Marvin, how quickly it had all happened. They'd known each other for 6 months when he proposed, married 6 months after that. I'd thought it was romantic at the time, but now I wondered if there had been other motivations. Had Marvin targeted her specifically because of the house? Because he'd somehow found out that she owned valuable property? The more I thought about it, the more sense it made. A criminal with gambling debts doesn't just randomly fall in love with the daughter of a middle-class accountant. He does research, he finds targets. And Skylar, with her legal ownership of a $350,000 house, would have been a perfect target. My phone buzzed with a text message. Skylar, Dad, we need to talk. Can you meet me for coffee tomorrow? I stared at the message for a long time before responding. No. Her reply came back almost immediately. Dad, please, I know you're upset, but there are things you don't understand. I turned off my phone without responding. There were things I understood perfectly now. I understood that my daughter had sold my house to pay her husband's gambling debts. I understood that she was probably involved in illegal activities. And I understood that she was only reaching out now because something had gone wrong. Maybe Marvin's criminal associates were closing in. Maybe she was starting to realize the danger she was in, or maybe she just needed more money and thought she could manipulate me one more time. But I was done being manipulated, done being the convenient solution to other people's problems. Tomorrow I would start making arrangements to visit my property in Montana. It was time to see what my father had left me. Time to start building a new life away from the wreckage of my old one. If Skylar wanted to save herself from the mess she'd created, she'd have to do it without my help. She'd made it clear that I wasn't part of her family anymore. Now she was about to learn what that really meant. The flight to Missoula was the first time in months that I felt genuinely excited about something. As the plane descended through the Montana sky, I could see endless expanses of forest and mountains, a landscape so different from Denver's urban sprawl that it felt like entering another world entirely. I'd rented a truck at the airport and drove the 45 minutes to the property with directions provided by a local real estate agent named Sarah Chen. She'd offered to meet me there, but I'd declined. I wanted to see my inheritance alone first, to understand what my father had left me without any outside influence. The dirt road leading to the property was rougher than I'd expected, winding through stands of pine and aspen trees. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat, I had to stop the truck and just stare. The photographs in my father's papers hadn't done it justice. The cabin was larger than I'd imagined, a solid log structure with a stone chimney and a wraparound porch that faced a small lake. The setting was breathtaking, mountains rising on all sides, the water reflecting the afternoon sky like a mirror. I walked around the property for over an hour, taking it all in. There was a small barn, a workshop, and what looked like a guest cabin closer to the lake. Everything was weathered but structurally sound. Someone had been maintaining it. Probably a property management company my father had arranged before he died. Inside the main cabin I found rustic but comfortable furnishings. A stone fireplace dominated one wall of the living room, and large windows offered spectacular views of the lake and mountains. The kitchen was simple but functional, and there were 3 bedrooms, including a master suite that opened onto a private deck. It was beautiful. More than beautiful. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I was exploring the workshop when I found something that stopped me cold. In an old wooden chest tucked under a workbench, I discovered a stack of envelopes tied with string. The handwriting on the top envelope was my mother's. "For Donald, when he's ready to understand," it read. My hand shook as I untied the string and opened the first envelope. Inside was a letter dated just 3 months before my mother died, written in her careful script. "My dearest Donald," it began. "If you're reading this, then you finally found your way to the Montana property. Your father and I always hoped you would, someday when you needed a place to start over." I sat down heavily on an old wooden crate and continued reading. "There are things I never told you about our family's history, things I thought might burden you unnecessarily while you were building your own life. But I realize now that these secrets might actually be gifts, especially if you ever find yourself in a position where you need to start fresh." The letter went on to explain things about my parents' past that I'd never known. My father hadn't just been a factory worker, as I'd always believed. He'd been an inventor who'd developed several patents for industrial equipment. Most of the money from those patents had gone into purchasing and developing properties, not just the Montana cabin, but several other investments across the West. "Your father was always worried about economic uncertainty," my mother wrote. "He remembered the Depression, how quickly everything could disappear, so he spread our assets across different states, different types of investments. Some are in property, some in businesses, some in accounts that have been growing quietly for decades." My heart was pounding as I opened the second envelope. Inside were more documents, deeds, investment statements, business partnership agreements, properties in Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado, shares in mining operations and timber companies, bank accounts that had been accruing interest for 20 years. The third envelope contained what appeared to be a will, but not the one that had been read after my mother's death. "This is the real will," the accompanying letter explained. "The one the lawyers read was only for the assets I wanted to make public. These other investments I'm leaving specifically to you, Donald, because I know you have your father's practical nature and his understanding of the value of security." I spent the next 2 hours going through every document, making notes, trying to calculate the total value of what my mother had left me. Properties that had appreciated significantly over the past 20 years, investment accounts that had been quietly growing, business partnerships that were still generating income. When I finally added it all up, I had to double-check my math. The total value was over $2.8 million. I sat back against the workshop wall, stunned. While I'd been living in what I thought was my house, paying someone else's mortgage, worrying about retirement savings, I'd been sitting on an inheritance worth nearly $3 million. The final envelope contained one more letter, this one shorter but somehow more profound. "Donald, I know this will come as a shock. I wanted to tell you about these assets while I was alive, but your father made me promise to wait until you truly needed them. He believed that having too much security too early in life could make a person soft, complacent. He wanted you to build your own character first, to understand the value of work and struggle." Tears stung my eyes as I read her words, but he also believed that there comes a time in every person's life when they need the freedom to make choices based on what's right, not what's financially necessary. If you're reading this, then that time has come for you. Use these resources wisely, my son. Use them to build the life you truly want, not the life others expect you to live. And remember, you owe nothing to anyone who has shown you that your well-being doesn't matter to them. I folded the letter carefully and sat in the growing dusk, listening to the sound of wind through the pine trees and water lapping gently against the lake shore. My mother had been dead for 15 years, but somehow she'd reached across time to give me exactly what I needed at exactly the right moment. Not just money, but permission. Permission to put myself first. Permission to walk away from people who didn't value me. Permission to be free. I called Sarah Chen, the real estate agent, and asked her to recommend a good attorney in Missoula. Within an hour, I was sitting in the law offices of Morrison and Associates, explaining my situation to Patricia Morrison, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who specialized in estate and property law. "These documents all appear to be in order," she said after reviewing my mother's papers. "The properties are legitimately yours, the investment accounts are accessible with proper identification, and the business partnerships are still active and profitable. How long will it take to access everything?" "Most of the accounts can be activated within a few days. The properties might take a week or two to fully transfer into your active name, but you already own them legally." She looked up from the papers. "Mr. Davidson, do you mind me asking why you're just discovering this inheritance now?" I told her about the house sale, about Skylar and Marvin, about finding my father's papers in the storage unit. Patricia listened without judgment, occasionally making notes. "I see," she said when I finished. "So you're looking to establish a new life, independent of your previous connections." "Exactly." "Well, these assets certainly give you that freedom. Have you thought about what you want to do?" I looked out her office window at the Montana mountains rising in the distance. "I think I want to stay here, at least for a while. Maybe permanently." Patricia smiled. "Montana's a good place for fresh starts. Let me make some calls, get the paperwork started. You could be accessing your accounts by the end of the week." That evening, I had dinner at a small restaurant in Missoula, trying to process everything that had happened. In the span of a week, I'd gone from thinking I was homeless and betrayed to discovering I was independently wealthy with multiple properties across the western United States. My phone buzzed with another text from Skylar. "Dad, please call me. Something's happened with Marvin. I need your help." I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Whatever was happening with Marvin was the consequence of choices Skylar had made. She'd chosen to trust a criminal over her own father. She'd chosen to sell my house to fund illegal activities. She'd chosen to treat me like I was disposable. Now she would have to live with those choices. I ordered another glass of wine and watched the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. Tomorrow I would start the process of claiming my inheritance, of building a new life in this beautiful place my parents had chosen for me decades ago. For the first time in years, I felt truly hopeful. And for the first time since walking into my empty house, I didn't think about Skylar at all. I'd been in Montana for 2 weeks, settling into the cabin and working with Patricia Morrison to access my inheritance, when Tom Bradley called with an update that would change everything. "Donald, you need to hear this." Tom's voice was urgent over the phone. "Things are moving fast with your son-in-law, and not in a good way for him or your daughter." I was sitting on the cabin's front porch, watching the morning mist rise from the lake. The peaceful setting made Tom's news feel surreal, like hearing about a war happening in another country. "What's going on?" "First, the good news, if you can call it that. The FBI raided Marvin's gambling operation 3 days ago. They've been building a case for months, and they finally had enough evidence to move." My coffee grew cold in my hands. Was Skylar there? No, but here's where it gets complicated. They found financial records that directly implicate her. Bank statements showing transfers from the house sale directly to accounts Marvin was using for the gambling operation. She's been listed as a person of interest. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of what Tom was telling me. So she's going to be arrested? Probably, but there's more. Marvin didn't go quietly. When the FBI showed up, he tried to run and ended up crashing his car into a tree about 2 miles from the warehouse. He's in the hospital with a broken leg and a concussion. And Skylar? That's where this gets really interesting. She's been calling everyone she can think of, trying to raise money for his bail and legal fees. She started with your mutual friends, then moved on to distant relatives. Everyone's been telling her the same thing. They don't have that kind of money. I could picture Skylar making those calls, probably using the same desperate tone she'd used when she needed money in college. The difference was, this time she wasn't asking for help with rent or books. She was asking people to fund a criminal defense. "How much bail are we talking about?" $500,000. And that's just for Marvin. If they arrest Skylar, when they arrest her, she'll need her own bail money and lawyer. I did quick math in my head. Even if she could raise 10% for a bail bondsman, she'd need $50,000 for Marvin alone. She doesn't have that kind of money. No, she doesn't. Which brings me to the reason I'm calling. 3 days ago, Skylar hired a private investigator to try to find you. That got my attention. Find me? She knows you left Denver, but she doesn't know where you went. The PI she hired is asking questions at hotels, rental car companies, even called your old employer, asking if anyone knew how to reach you. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana morning air. She's trying to track me down. It gets worse. Yesterday, she filed a missing person report with the Denver police, claiming you disappeared without telling anyone where you were going, and she's worried about your mental state. My mental state? According to the report, she told police that you've been acting erratically since the house sale, that you made concerning statements about not wanting to live anymore, and that she's afraid you might hurt yourself. The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. She's trying to make it look like I'm suicidal so the police will help her find me. That's exactly what she's doing, and if they do find you, she'll probably show up with some story about how worried she's been, how much she loves you, how she needs your help during this difficult time. I stood up and walked to the porch railing, looking out over the lake. A family of deer was drinking at the water's edge, completely peaceful, unaware of human drama and manipulation. "Tom, what do you think she'll do when she finds out about my inheritance?" "Honestly, I think she'll try to claim you're not mentally competent to handle your own finances. If she can convince a judge that you're having a mental health crisis, she might be able to get some kind of guardianship or conservatorship." The idea was so appalling that I had to grip the railing to steady myself. She would do that? Donald, this woman sold your house without telling you to fund her husband's criminal operation. She threw away your father's furniture and told you to find a hotel room. Now she's lying to police about your mental state to try to force you to help her again. What exactly do you think she wouldn't do? He was right, of course. I'd been thinking of Skylar as misguided, as someone who'd made bad choices under Marvin's influence. But the truth was much darker. She was actively trying to manipulate law enforcement to locate me against my will, planning to lie about my mental capacity to gain access to my money. "There's something else," Tom continued. "I've been monitoring her social media accounts. She's been posting about how heartbroken she is that her father abandoned her during her time of need. Lots of sympathy from friends, lots of comments about what a terrible daughter she must be for her own father to disappear when she needs him most. She's building a narrative. Exactly. If she can establish that you're the kind of person who would abandon his daughter during a crisis, it supports her story that you're not mentally stable. I thought about my mother's letter, her words about having the freedom to make choices based on what's right rather than what's financially necessary. Tom, I want you to stop monitoring the situation. Are you sure? Things are moving fast and, I'm sure, send me your final report and your bill, but I don't want to know what happens next. There was a pause. Donald, I have to ask, are you really prepared to let your daughter face federal charges without trying to help her? It was a fair question, one I'd been wrestling with since Tom's first call. She's not facing charges because of bad luck or circumstances beyond her control. She's facing charges because she chose to participate in criminal activity, because she chose to sell my house to fund that activity, because she chose her husband over her father. Even so, she's still your daughter. Is she? I asked. Because daughters don't steal their fathers' homes. Daughters don't throw away family heirlooms like garbage. Daughters don't lie to police to try to force their fathers to rescue them from consequences they brought on themselves. Tom was quiet for a moment. What if she really does love you and just made terrible mistakes? Then she would have called me to apologize, not to ask for money. She would have tried to make things right before her world started falling apart, not after. I could hear Tom typing on his computer. All right, Donald, I'll send you my final report by email. But can I give you one piece of advice? Of course. Change your phone number. Get a new cell phone, new service provider, everything. If Skylar is determined to find you, eventually she will. And when she does, you don't want her to be able to reach you unless you decide to let her. After I hung up, I sat on the porch for a long time thinking about Tom's advice. Changing my phone number felt like such a final step, cutting the last thread that connected me to my old life. But maybe that's exactly what I needed to do. I drove into Missoula that afternoon and bought a new phone with a Montana number. When I got back to the cabin, I called Patricia Morrison and gave her the new number, then did the same with the property management company and my bank. My old phone, with all its missed calls and desperate text messages from Skylar, I turned off and put in a drawer. That evening, I built a fire in the cabin's fireplace and sat watching the flames dance against the stone hearth. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, the first of the season. The mountains were disappearing into white silence. For the first time in weeks, my phone didn't buzz with messages from my daughter. No desperate pleas for help, no guilt-inducing questions about how I could abandon her in her time of need, just silence. And in that silence, I finally understood what my mother had meant about the freedom to make choices based on what's right, rather than what's financially necessary. I'd spent 62 years believing that family obligations trumped everything else, that being a good father meant sacrificing my own well-being for my daughter's benefit, no matter what she did or how she treated me. But sitting in my father's cabin, surrounded by the inheritance my parents had carefully preserved for me, I realized that enabling someone's destructive behavior isn't love, it's cowardice. Real love sometimes means stepping back and letting people face the consequences of their choices, even when that person is your daughter, even when it breaks your heart. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the mountains in pristine white. Tomorrow, I would wake up in my own home, on my own land, with my own money, beholden to no one who didn't value me. For the first time in my adult life, I was truly free, and I intended to stay that way. 6 months later, I was sitting on my porch watching the spring ice break up on the lake when I saw a car I didn't recognize coming up the dirt road. My first instinct was concern. Very few people knew where I lived, and I'd grown to treasure my privacy. The car was a rental sedan, clearly not built for mountain roads. It stopped near my truck, and I watched as a woman got out, looking around uncertainly at the cabin and the lake beyond. It took me a moment to recognize her. Skylar looked thin, older than her 34 years, wearing jeans and a simple sweater that were a far cry from the designer clothes she'd favored during her marriage to Marvin. I didn't get up from my chair. I just sat there, coffee growing cold in my hands, watching my daughter approach the porch like she was walking through a minefield. "Hi, Dad." Her voice was small, uncertain. The confident woman who'd told me to find a hotel room was gone, replaced by someone who looked like she hadn't been sleeping well. "Skylar," I kept my voice neutral. "How did you find me?" It took a while, and cost money I didn't really have. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, not presuming to come up without invitation. Can we talk? I studied her face, looking for signs of the manipulation I'd grown to expect, but she just looked tired, defeated. Depends on what you want to talk about. I want to apologize. For which part? She flinched at that. All of it. The house, the way I treated you, the things I said, everything. I gestured to one of the empty chairs on the porch. She climbed the steps slowly and sat down, keeping careful distance between us. Marvin pleaded guilty, she said after a long moment, to all the gambling charges, money laundering, everything. He got 8 years in federal prison. And you? I took a plea deal, 2 years probation, community service, restitution payments. She looked out at the lake. I had to testify against him to get it. That must have been difficult. She let out a bitter laugh. You know what was difficult? Realizing that the man I destroyed my relationship with my father for was never the person I thought he was. Finding out that he'd been planning to leave me and disappear with whatever money was left from the house sale, I absorbed this information without surprise. When did you find that out? During the investigation. The FBI found evidence that he'd been setting up bank accounts in other states, making plans to run if things went bad. I was never part of those plans. She turned to look at me. He was going to abandon me the same way I abandoned you. I see. Dad, I lost everything. The house is gone, obviously. Our apartment, our cars, our bank accounts, all seized as proceeds of criminal activity. I'm living in a studio apartment and working at a grocery store. She seemed to expect some response to this, but I remained silent. I know I have no right to ask, she continued, but I was hoping maybe we could start over. Maybe I could make things right between us. I took a sip of my cold coffee, studying her face. What does making things right look like to you, Skylar? I don't know. I guess I was hoping you'd give me a chance to show you that I'm not the person I was when I was with Marvin, that I can be the daughter you deserved. And what would you need from me to do that? She looked uncomfortable. Well, I know you're doing well. This place, the property. You're obviously not the struggling retiree I thought you were. There it was, the real reason for her visit. I'm not asking for money, she said quickly, seeing my expression. I need help getting back on my feet. Maybe a loan or a place to stay until I can save enough for a decent apartment. I set down my coffee cup and leaned back in my chair. Skylar, do you remember what you said to me the night I came back from vacation? She looked down at her hands. I said a lot of things I regret. You told me that the house being sold wasn't your problem anymore. You told me to find a hotel room. You watched me stand in my empty kitchen, homeless and confused, and you felt nothing. I was scared. Marvin had convinced me that... Stop. My voice was quiet but firm. Don't blame Marvin for your choices. He didn't force you to sell my house. He didn't force you to throw away my father's furniture. He didn't force you to look at your own father with contempt. Tears started sliding down her cheeks. I know I was terrible to you, but I was young and stupid and in love with the wrong person. You were 33 years old, Skylar. That's not young. That's old enough to know right from wrong. We sat in silence for several minutes. A loon called from across the lake, its voice echoing off the mountains. What do you want me to say? She asked finally. I don't want you to say anything. I want you to understand something. I turned to face her fully. The night you sold my house, you told me I wasn't your problem anymore. Well, your problems aren't mine anymore either. Her face crumpled. Dad, please. I'm your daughter. Are you? Because daughters don't steal from their fathers. Daughters don't participate in criminal conspiracies. Daughters don't abandon their fathers and then show up asking for help when their own lives fall apart. I was wrong. I was so wrong about everything. But I've learned from my mistakes. Have you? Or have you just learned that the consequences are more painful than you expected? She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. What would it take for you to forgive me? I thought about that question for a long time. Skylar, forgiveness isn't something you can earn by showing up and apologizing. It's something that happens when the person who was hurt decides they're ready to let go of the pain. Are you ready? I am, but that doesn't mean I'm ready to let you back into my life. Her breath caught. I don't understand. I forgive you for selling my house. I forgive you for the cruelty, for the betrayal, for all of it. But forgiveness doesn't mean we go back to the way things were. It means I'm no longer angry about what happened, but we're still family. No, Skylar, we're not. I stood up and walked to the porch railing. Family is about more than blood. It's about love, respect, loyalty, support during difficult times. You showed me that those things don't exist between us. They could exist again if you gave me a chance. I turned back to her. Why would I take that risk? So you can hurt me again the next time you're desperate? So you can sell whatever I have left when you need money for your next bad decision? I would never do that again. You said you'd never sell my house. You said you'd never let anyone hurt me. You said a lot of things that turned out not to be true. She sat there crying quietly, and for a moment I felt something that might have been sympathy. But then I remembered the coldness in her voice when she told me to find a hotel, and the feeling passed. I think you should leave now, I said gently. Dad, please. Skylar. I looked at her one last time. This woman who shared my blood but not my values. I hope you build a good life for yourself. I hope you learn to make better choices and find happiness. But I won't be part of that life. She stood up slowly, defeat written in every line of her body. If I could take it all back. But you can't. And even if you could, the person who made those choices would still be you. I can't forget that. She walked down the porch steps and back to her rental car. At the driver's side door, she turned back one more time. I love you, Dad. I know you do, in your way. But love without respect, without loyalty, without basic human decency, that's not enough anymore. I watched her drive away, the dust from her car settling slowly in the mountain air. Then I sat back down in my chair and picked up my coffee. The lake was perfectly still now, reflecting the mountains and sky like a mirror. A hawk circled high overhead, riding the thermals between the peaks. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt completely at peace. My daughter was alive, apparently learning to take responsibility for her choices, building a new life after the destruction of her old one. That was enough. I didn't need to be part of that life to be satisfied that she would be okay. And I was more than okay. I was free. That evening I called Patricia Morrison and made arrangements to donate $50,000 to a local organization that helped families of incarcerated individuals. It seemed like an appropriate use for some of my inheritance, helping people who were dealing with the consequences of their loved ones' criminal choices, people who were innocent victims rather than willing participants. I also made arrangements to establish a scholarship fund at the local community college for students studying practical trades. Another $50,000 invested in people who were building something positive rather than tearing things down. My parents had left me this inheritance so I could make choices based on what was right rather than what was financially necessary. Using part of it to help others felt exactly right. 6 months later, I was still living in the Montana cabin, no longer just visiting my inheritance, but truly making it my home. I'd made friends in town, joined a hiking group, even started dating a woman named Ellen who ran the local bookstore. Life was good, simple, honest, peaceful. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered what had become of Skylar, whether she'd learned from her experiences, whether she'd found a way to rebuild her life on a foundation of integrity rather than manipulation. But mostly, I didn't think about her at all. I'd spent 34 years being her father, and those years had taught me everything I needed to know about who she really was. That knowledge had set me free to build a life based on my own values, surrounded by people who respected and appreciated me. My parents would have been proud, and for the first time in years, I was proud of myself too.